Keep your hands clean. This is a tall order, especially for gangsters. After all, everyone makes mistakes.
But I never should have raised him about eating pussy.
But the truly clever make sure that someone or something else takes the blame.
Cunnilingus and psychiatry brought us to this.
A convenient scapegoat should always be kept around for such moments.
I'm not a fake. I never was.
Excuse me?
It was the medication I was on.
Hey Sopranos fans, welcome to another episode here on Bully Whispers, and we are here today to check out Law 26 of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, Keep Your Hands Clean, in the TV show The Sopranos. This law consists of two parts. The first, as you may have guessed, is to use a scapegoat, and the second is to use the cat's paw. That is to say, get someone else to do it for you. These are both concepts that we see a lot of in The Sopranos, since no one wants to take responsibility for their actions, either legally or morally, and they all want someone else to do the work. Now, when it comes to scapegoating, we see this done effectively in a legal sense almost immediately when Tony lets Junior become boss so that he will take the fall. But as a whole, Tony's organization isn't set up well at all to do so in the sense of underworld tensions, internal or external. You see, Tony's problem was that he never had a consistent underboss. It was Paulie for a bit, then it was going to be Christopher for a bit, but that obviously didn't work out, and for a while it just seemed to be whoever Tony liked in the moment before landing on Bobby Bacala. However, Sil remained a consistent consigliere, and as a result, he ends up being the primary point of contact, so to speak, between upper management and the troops throughout the show, which is not good for Tony, and here's why. Sil's primary function, regardless of the title within that family, was as a negotiator and soother of waters, which fit his talents perfectly. He was excellent in that capacity, and as such, he may have been the most generally liked gangster on the show. However, without a consistent third person up there, enforcement usually falls on Tony. Sil may pass the message, but Tony usually has to make sure it's enforced, and here's the problem for Tony. Resentment can often build more quickly towards the law enforcers than towards the law givers, especially among people who deal with it daily, because nobody cares about unenforced laws. But when you are both, it becomes much harder to shift blame. An historical example Greene cites is Cesare Borgia's subjugation of Romagna. Prior to Borgia's efforts to bring the region under control, it was essentially a lawless area dominated by criminals and feuding families. He knew it would take a lot to keep this unruly bunch under control, so he sent Ramiro de Lorca, known to be a cruel and vigorous man there, giving him absolute power to try and bring law and order to the area, and bring law and order he did. With energy and violence, de Lorca established a severe, brutal justice to Romagna, and soon rid it of almost all of its lawless elements. But in his zeal, he often went too far, and it wasn't long before the locals began to resent and even hate him. Borgia then showed up and said he didn't approve of the violent and cruel acts that were a result of de Lorca's brutal nature, and this is a strategy that Tony largely can't employ. Since Tony has no real upper management enforcement other than himself, he largely has to operate directly through the captains, and I'm not sure how it is in real life, but in the show, most capos are shown as closer to being one of the guys than to being upper management, making it much easier to spot Tony's hand at work. It also means that when Tony does successfully set someone up to be a potential scapegoat for what might be viewed as a questionable act, it is almost always reactionary, like with Ralph in the Jackie Jr. situation. When he does try to be proactive, like putting Gigi in charge of the April crew, it's obvious what he is trying to do because there is no separation between him and any executive decisions, and this is where Paulie Walnuts is criminally underutilized by Tony, pun intended. Of all Tony's guys, Paulie would be by far the best candidate to fill the role of underboss/enforcement arm as a permanent fixture. Now, some might say Ralph or Richie. Let me know what you think in the comments, but I'll get to them in a bit. Whoever fills this spot would need to be both rash and aggressive, otherwise Tony would never be able to blame anything on him believably. For example, later on in the series when Bobby Bacala occupied that spot, if Tony had wanted to clean a little house and crack some heads while doing it, but without appearing like he wanted that much violence, he would have been shit out of luck. No one would ever believe him if he said that he didn't approve of this and that Bobby just took it too far, because Bobby's not the type to ever take it too far. Tony is, and everyone knows it. Paulie, on the other hand, is very rash, very aggressive, and has a long-standing reputation for taking things too far, which make him an amazing cat's paw and eventually maybe scapegoat. That being said, what separates him from someone like Richie or Christopher is that he is actually fairly timid around upper management, which will pop up again in a bit. However, once emboldened by Tony, Paulie would follow through on orders with an almost religious zeal, and much like Richie, no one really likes him enough to get behind him in any potential coup attempts. Actually, if you think about it, Tony doesn't really start becoming disliked enough for anyone to pull off a coup until he starts breaking Law 26 in the worst way by making himself the scapegoat for other people, such as Tony B., and bringing the burden of their transgressions onto himself and his family. Now, with Paulie in that position, for some things he would make a great scapegoat, but for others not so much. If it's for little things getting taken too far, perhaps a little light violence, Paulie Walnuts is perfect. Tony can aggressively push his interest through Paulie, and if it ends up going a bit too far, he can just claim that Paulie got a bit carried away with it, and people would believe it because that sounds like something Paulie would do. However, when it comes to bigger things, especially outside of the family, like any moves against New York's interest, Paulie wouldn't be nearly as effective. For all of his big talk, especially when he was mad at Johnny Sack, Paulie tended to be very timid around people he viewed as more powerful, and everyone knew it. Anything involving New York would be a little too bold for him, so people would assume Tony was behind it no matter what was said. Now, there is someone who could have been great in this scenario, but we will get to that in a bit. When it comes to using the cat's paw, Tony is a bit more effective, as we see with him using Christopher and the TVs to get Feech sent back to jail, but he is Pee-wee League compared to the masterclass in cat's paw usage and scapegoat setup that we see the New York gangsters put on throughout the show. I'm not going to get into too much detail here because I've covered it more in depth in Carmine Sr., Johnny Sack's, and Butchie's episodes respectively, but both Johnny Sack and Carmine Sr. were attempting to use Tony as a cat's paw in killing the other, with both of them having him in prime position to take all of the blame due to the tensions between New York and New Jersey at the time. Beyond that, when you take a closer look at the timeline of events and how they played out, there is a decent chance that Carmine Sr. was also using Johnny Sack in both of those capacities by sending him to New Jersey, and Johnny himself gave Carmine deniability when he said that the move to New Jersey wasn't Carmine's favorite topic. After Johnny and Carmine are out of the picture, we see Butch stepping up to the plate with Phil Leotardo. Butch amps Phil up for a war, knowing the tensions he has with New Jersey, talking about wiping out their whole family, and then shortly after the war starts, he says it's gone too far, blames it all on Phil, and lets him take the fall. Now, this may have just been a maneuver to get more power in New York, but if the Paulie, Patsy, Butch conspiracy theory to take out Tony in the end is true, then he may have pulled a maneuver similar to Mao Zedong. Greene notes how Mao teamed up with his enemy to fight a mutual enemy in Japan, letting them do most of the work and take most of the damage, leaving them in a weakened state, so Mao can come in later and take everything. If Butch's goal was always to take all of New Jersey, he would be well on his way. Unfortunately for Tony, he really only has one person on his roster that would be useful in this capacity against New York, and Tony killed him over a horse, at least as far as everyone knew. Shortly after Tony kills Ralph, things begin to go south with New York, and though Ralph is a bit too erratic for upper management, he could have been infinitely valuable as a capo who deals directly with New York a lot. Despite all of his talk, Ralph, like Paulie, seemed to be desperately seeking validation from those above him, so Tony could get him to push the envelope with New York. And he is such a spastic coke fiend that everyone would believe Tony if he said that Ralphie just went rogue. In killing Ralph, Tony killed the only card he could play against New York while still maintaining plausible deniability. No one he had left after that would be viewed as someone who would go against them without Tony's approval. Not Sil, definitely not Bobby, really not even Christopher. Chris was definitely bold enough to fight New York, but he never would have picked that fight on his own, and they know it. For those of you who've made it this far, thank you, and you may have noticed that I focused primarily on underworld scapegoating and not on the moral side of it. This isn't because it doesn't show up in the show, a large part of Melfi's sessions are addressing just that. It's because it would have been an episode in and of itself. Melfi's sessions are literally a siren song from Greek mythology. The comparisons are there, right down to the lyrics of the song itself, so if that's something you would be interested in seeing in its own episode, let me know. Well, as always, thanks for watching another episode here on Bully Whispers. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.